This evening's presenter is Dr. Peter Janata. He comes to us from UC Davis and the Center for Mind and Brain. He's going to present his research on neurological links between music and memories. He's been a professor at the Center for Mind and Brain at UC Davis since 2004. He received his PhD from the University of Oregon's Institute of Neuroscience and has also taught at Reed College and Dartmouth. I will let him talk more about his research, and let's go ahead and welcome Dr. Janata.
Okay, thank you very much. So before I get started, just to make sure, can everyone hear me in back? Yeah, it's okay. It's not overwhelmingly loud. Okay, great. Well, thank you all for coming out. It's always a great day when you can combine skiing and science, at least in my mind. And so it's great that we're taking advantage of the lull between storms to do a bit of science. So what I'd like to do today is share with you one of the projects that I've been working on over the past few years in the lab. And over the past few, so I'm a cognitive neuroscientist. I try to understand how the human brain works, and I'm also fascinated by music and the fact that it's been around with humankind for so long. And I think it really begs the question, why we engage with music and spend tremendous resources on it in the way that we do. It really suggests that there's some powerful connection between music and brain. And so my approach is to try to examine some of the really strong experiences that we have with music that people can relate to and cherish, because it seems that those will hopefully give us some of the deeper insights into how the brain is organized in general. So one set of these, so one of these areas is the topic of music-evoked autobiographical memories, which I'll be focusing on this evening. And just a couple of points about it that make it particularly salient is that it's a vehicle for nostalgia and other life-affirming thoughts and emotions, as I'll describe in a moment. And then on a practical level, over the past 6 to 10 years, there's been quite a bit of research demonstrating that people with Alzheimer's disease still remain very responsive to music from their past. The other area that I study is the feeling of being in the groove, which we're trying to get this established as a psychological phenomenon that psychologists aren't afraid to talk about. We're actually making progress on that. And this is basically this urge to move with music, or more generally the sense of being one with music or with others with whom one is interacting during a musical experience. So again, a very, very strong experience that we have with music. Okay, today I'm going to focus on the music-evoked memories. So why is music-evoked remembering so emotionally powerful? And one possibility is because it triggers nostalgia. This then begs the question of, well, why would nostalgia be so important? After all, so nostalgia is defined as a sentimental longing or wistful affection for the past. And in its original conception, and for the longest time, it was viewed, perhaps maybe still is by many people, as a malady. Okay, that it's really just a way for people to live in the past instead of dealing with the present and the future. So it's just this maladaptive emotion. We also know that it's kind of a bittersweet emotion, so it has happy components and sad components, and one thing one can ask, do these actually occur in equal measure to support this nostalgic remembering? Well, it turns out that over the past 6 years or so, there's been a whole bunch of research on nostalgia, mainly by these two fellows in England, Konstantin Sedekaides and Tim Wiltshut, and then some work by a former graduate student of mine, Fred Barrett. This body of research basically shows that nostalgia is largely a positive emotion, It bolsters a sense of meaning in life. It increases optimism, so it's actually a forward-looking emotion. And as we've shown, that music is a potent trigger of nostalgia. So this is just a slide that tries to summarize this body of literature on nostalgia. And on the left here, we see a list of triggers, so things that create a need for nostalgia. They make a person start feeling nostalgic, wanting to draw on their past experiences. One of these things is need to belong. So people who feel a very strong need to belong socially tend to be more prone to experiencing nostalgia. Loneliness triggers nostalgia, and boredom triggers nostalgia, and existential threat triggers nostalgia. So basically, in the laboratory, what you do, if you give people passages to read of French existentialists or various things that will, threaten your sense of well-being in life, people start feeling nostalgic. And what happens, the way this happens, is basically existential threat and boredom increase this need for meaning in life. You start searching for meaning in life, and so you start trying to grab a hold of nostalgia. Well, what fills that nostalgic experience? What can actually trigger some sort of nostalgic reverie that can actually turn it into this positive thing that I'm suggesting that it is? Well, so perhaps probably not surprising to most of you, is that music that one associates with one's past and associated lyrics can increase these positive feelings, general positive affect. They increase this feeling nostalgic. And they largely do this via social connectedness. So they help create feelings that you're actually connected with your various friends, family members, what have you. And then this in turn increases this sense of meaning in life. It turns out that nostalgia, again, operating via these social feelings, can help increase self-esteem and thereby increase optimism with respect to the future. So I think this is really interesting to realize that nostalgia can be, and engaging in nostalgic thought can be a very powerful and positive thing for a person. Just quickly, this is work that we did in the lab to characterize emotions elicited by nostalgic songs compared to non-nostalgic but still memory-evoking songs, or songs that were neither nostalgic nor memory-evoking. And the top emotions here tend to be love across the board. Where we see differences is in terms of the negative emotions. So when it's nostalgia-evoking music, they tend to be sadness, disappointment, suffering, sympathy. So sadness-related emotions. Whereas when a song isn't nostalgic or memory-evoking, it tends to be irritation and disgust. I think this has to do with the fairly heavy rap and hip-hop sample of music in the library we've been using. But what's interesting, this speaks now to this notion of nostalgia being both positive and negative emotions, is that if you ask people after they've heard a piece of music and been experiencing emotions with it, did they experience both positive and negative emotions? Well, if it's not memory-evoking or nostalgic, it's only about 4% of the songs have this mixed emotion quality. If it's memory-evoking, that number goes up a little bit, but not a lot. But if they're nostalgic songs, about almost 15% have both positive and negative, so generally the joy or love and sadness mixed in. But it's still not a huge number. So overall, the nostalgia-evoking songs actually tend to be positive, evoke positive emotions, even though they might have this slight tinge of sadness to them. Okay, so the content of nostalgia is obviously autobiographical. It's an emotion that's quintessentially associated with memory. And so the question then becomes, can we find traces of music-evoked autobiographical memories in the brain? And that's going to be the bulk of what I described to you today. So how do we do this? So to study music-evoked autobiographical memories, it's a little bit of a challenge because they're different for every different individual, right? So one song might evoke one memory in a person and evoke no memory in another person. So how can we reliably study this in the lab? Well, what we do is we take 30-second excerpts of songs that were on the Billboard Pop and R&B charts. Basically, we take those previews that you can get on the iTunes Music Store. Right? Those are the samples that we use. And we now select the music so that it was on the charts during the person's extended childhood. So when they were between 7 and 19 years of age. And we play them one of these excerpts, and then afterward we ask them, was it familiar? How memory-evoking or autobiographically salient was it? Was it pleasing, displeasing? How vivid were any visual images that were evoked? And then for those songs that people label as weakly or strongly autobiographical, we then follow up with several forms and open-ended response options. So some of the follow-up questions are, does it remind you of a specific event, person, or period in your life? Does it have emotions associated with it? If so, what emotions and how strongly did you experience them? And then subjects provide written descriptions, if they want, of their memories. So this way we can get at the content. And using this overall strategy, on average, about half of the songs are unfamiliar. And then of the half that are familiar, about half are memory-evoking, which is really wonderful from an experimental perspective, because then we can compare those various conditions. We have our control conditions. So unfamiliar music controls for the familiar music, and then the familiar music controls for the memory-evoking music. Okay, so what's some of the content of these memories? So people tend to be reminded of other people or times from their past. Those people are typically friends or significant others. People generally experience these songs as being pleasing, and they agree that the song often evokes an emotion, and also that that emotion was experienced somewhat or fairly strongly in the moment. So we have, I think, a reasonably compelling way of inducing these memories and emotions in the laboratory. Okay, here this is just a list of endorsed emotions. So the top one was happy and youthful, where the top two, nostalgia, here is in third place. In our hands, now I should say this is all a sample of college students, and in our hands the emotions tend to be mainly positive that are evoked, fewer negative emotions. Okay, so if we look at the content of some of these memories, some are detailed. So this first one describes a general lifetime period type of memory. So this was a popular song during the summer when I was in the 4th or 5th grade. It just reminded me of the park where I spent most of my summer. Okay, kind of vague. Others are very specific though, such as this one. A friend from high school in the car at a specific intersection with Diablo Boulevard and Nevada Boulevard in Nevada, California, waiting at a red light. And thanks to Google, we have an image of maybe what this looks like in the person's head with the red light and everything. Now, what's remarkable is for some subjects, you can kind of look across all the memory-evoking. Let me make sure this sound works here. Oops. Oh, there we go. Right. Memory-evoking songs, and sort of start stringing together a little bit of that person's biography. So here's one subject describing periods of her life. In response to this song, she simply stated, I was in junior high. Then this song came up.
I'm
was not quite 18 yet. My boyfriend seemed like everything for me in this world. I hadn't gone to college yet, so he was all I knew. Alicia Keys comes up. I was young and crazy. I was so in love, so in love. Ashley Simpson. I was finishing high school, starting college away from my boyfriend. We talked on the phone a lot. Clearly in love. Where's this gonna go? This song came up. I was beginning to mature, no longer innocent. I realized guys are all the same, cheating dogs and assholes. I couldn't believe when I saw this. I was like, "This is great." You know? Lecture fodder. Anyway, you can kind of tell actually from the lyrics, if you listen closely to the lyrics, it kind of suggests the emotional content of these memories, which is something we haven't really followed up on very much, but it'll be very interesting. So clearly, you know, we're taking a person through a series of memories here, and what we would like to do is understand what's going on in the brain when a person's going through that. Okay, so just to lead into this, the first thing I need to point out is that our experiences with music involve many active psychological processes. So sort of for a long time, people thought, well, just like we have certain parts of the brain that seem to be specialized for language, there should be parts of the brain that are specialized for music, and let's go find the music part of the brain. Well, it really doesn't work that way, okay, and here's why. So, for example, even just when experiencing music-evoked autobiographical memory, we can talk about the basic perception of the music, so the hearing of the music. But now if you're listening to this familiar memory-evoking song and you're singing along in your mind, okay, you've got the lyrics going in your mind, you're anticipating the next notes in the melody, you're forming expectations for what's going to come next. A lot of research, some of our own and research from many other labs, shows that kind of covert vocalization actually engages the action systems of the brain. And I'll return to that point in a moment. You might have visual images that come into your mind, and that act of visual imagery may in fact activate visual processing areas of the brain. We have various forms of memory retrieval that are happening, either for the song itself or for the associated memories. And then, of course, there are parts of the brain that have to do with emotion, which we may experience in great measure with music, whether it's memory-evoking or not. So basically, a variety of brain systems are going to need to come together to support this strong experience that we're having with the music. Okay, now, after having said all of that, I will now highlight a particular brain area called the medial prefrontal cortex. And actually started all these studies hypothesizing that music, memories, and emotions may be linked here in the medial prefrontal cortex. Now, why would I have thought that? Well, the first clue was from a study I did when I was still at Dartmouth, where we were trying to figure out what happens in the brain when you follow a melody that moves around through all the major and minor keys. Okay, we try to find those parts of the brain, and I'll explain what these colored rectangles mean in just a little bit. But right now I just want to say that the one part of the brain that consistently did this across sessions within subjects and across multiple subjects was in fact the medial prefrontal cortex. And this was a bit of a puzzle because this isn't the primary auditory cortex. And so why would this region be doing it? Well, at the same time, there was another researcher at Dartmouth who was just doing these studies where he put people in the scanner and he gave them tasks in which they had to, view a picture or view a word, and then think about how well does this describe me. as opposed to how well does this describe, some other person. And whenever people engage in that sort of self-referential thought, part of the medial prefrontal cortex became more active. And so that got me to thinking, wow, we have identified this part of the brain that really seems to care about musical structure and sort of that flow of thought or the flow of music and perhaps linking those two. And obviously we have these strong remembering experiences with music, and the medial prefrontal cortex engages in this sort of self-referential processing. Maybe this is where music and memories are going to be bound up. At the time, there was one other study showing activation of the medial prefrontal cortex. Basically, if you play little piano pieces, and you can either make them really dissonant, they sound like a 7-year-old practicing their piano lessons and not getting it right at all, or you can make it sound pretty reasonable, and as it sounds more reasonable, these emotion-related areas become more active. Another study where people listened to various excerpts and made familiarity judgments about them engaged the medial prefrontal cortex. And then finally here, a study that came out as I was doing my studies compared familiar music and familiar odors, familiar smells. And if you think about sort of the other really powerful memory-evoking stimulus, smell, I regard smell as one of them, then photographs and music, kind of in my mind, are the top three. I see a hand up there, but is it a quick question?
Yeah. Are we looking at like an MRI or a PET? What are we looking
at? I'm sorry. Yes, and what I've been showing you, I have my sort of MRI explanation slide in just a moment. But yes, what we're looking at here are MRI slices through the brain. And these little colored blobs just represent regions that are significantly active in these particular conditions that I've been describing. Yeah. And again, here the main focus is just the medial prefrontal cortex. Now, the final sort of intriguing piece of evidence about the medial prefrontal cortex comes, as I mentioned earlier, this observation that Alzheimer's individuals still respond very strongly to music from their past. In fact, even if they're nonverbal, you might put on a piece of music from their past and they might start singing along, start moving along, they light up emotionally. It's a very powerful experience for them, for the caregivers, for everyone in the room. And what's interesting is that if you look at how the atrophy of the brain progresses over the course of Alzheimer's disease, that's what's shown here. Areas in red are more heavily atrophied areas than those in blue. You find that the medial prefrontal cortex up here in front is relatively spared compared to the rest of the brain. And so this suggests that maybe this is a substrate where, again, music, memory, and emotions may come together and still be supported even in the case of Alzheimer's. Okay, so just a brief comment about neuroimaging methods. Okay, probably many of you read newspaper articles, and it's like the latest and greatest discovery about the brain. And there may be a picture of, like I've been showing you, slice through the brain and some colorful blob on there. And what I would like to do is just take a couple of moments to try to explain to you how those colored blobs get there. Okay, and it's not too terribly complicated. Basically, what one is doing, this is just schematized here in cartoon form, this white line would be the so-called blood oxygen level dependent signal that you're measuring from a small little chunk of the brain. And the signal that one is measuring is actually not a direct measure of neural activity. It's essentially a measure of the metabolic consequences of neural activity. So when you have a whole bunch of neurons that are very, very active, they have a requirement for oxygen and for glucose. And so there's very, very fine local regulation of the blood supply within the brain. And by virtue of that very fine regulation, this measurable signal arises. And so one records a signal, and then in order, what you have to do is you have to have some model of what is happening to my subject while they're lying in the scanner. And so this blue line just schematizes one variable. So it might be, for example, when music starts playing, it turns on, it goes on for 30 seconds, then it turns off, and then it's off, 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 something else happens here, and then, okay, music turns on again, it goes off, right? So you just have this model. Music's playing, it's not playing. Okay? And then you compare those two signals, the measured signal and your model of what's happening to the subject, and you correlate the two signals, and if it's statistically significant, the correlation, and it's significant across a whole bunch of subjects within that area, then you can assign a color to it, basically, and put that color in that part of the brain. And, anyway, so that's how you get to those types of images. Okay, so just to illustrate what we're doing now with these music-evoked memories, so for people who've gone through our procedure and we're fairly certain that they're going to have music-evoked memories when we're playing songs at random, you know, from the Billboard Pop and R&B charts from their childhood, we bring them into the scanner and essentially do the same thing. And this graph here illustrates the statistical model that we use to analyze the activity. So we have time running from left to right, and this bottom row illustrates simply when music is playing. So each white bar here is when music was playing for 30 seconds. So music's playing, and it's not playing, it's playing again. Now, after each excerpt, people answer a series of questions. How familiar was it? How memory-evoking was it? And how pleasing was it? And then based on their answers, we can create 3 additional variables that now code for familiar music, or memory-evoking music, or pleasing music. So, for example, this first excerpt was familiar to the person, but it wasn't at all memory-evoking. It was mildly pleasing. Okay? The second excerpt was familiar, it was very memory-evoking, and it was very pleasing. Okay? And so, based on this, then we can sort of tease apart the brain areas that are responding more when it's familiar or more when it's memory-evoking. And that's now summarized in this slide. So what we're seeing, this is now for the group of subjects, and what we're seeing are slices through the brain taken like this, starting on the left side, progressing through to the middle of the brain, and then out to the right side. And areas in green are now areas that become more active when you're listening to familiar music. So, you know, we've got green blobs scattered all over the brain. What in the world does this mean? Well, what we can do is we can now ask, what do all of these regions do? Like, what do all the other various studies that have been done in cognitive neuroscience tell us about these particular brain regions? And most of the brain regions shown in green here are part of this action system that I was mentioning earlier. I'll focus here on in the left hemisphere. This is an area known as Broca's area that probably many of you have heard about, which is very important for language production. So people with damage to this part of the brain have trouble speaking. They have trouble sequencing together words to make sentences. Okay? And so what we're seeing now, when you're listening to more familiar music, presumably you're singing along in your mind, we see activation of these so-called premotor regions. Now, this slice here through the middle of the brain really tells it all. So Regions in blue are those for music that was experienced as more pleasing, and we see activation here of the ventral medial prefrontal cortex, which is very important for emotion processing and emotion regulation. And then up here in red and yellow, we see areas that responded more when the music was more memory-evoking. And we can look at this now in the context of the large body of literature that's accumulated over the past 10 years. So this is from a meta-analysis of over 200 studies in which activation of the medial prefrontal cortex was observed. And so we can ask, well, what do those studies look at? So one of these things are TOM beliefs, theory of mind beliefs. This is essentially social cognition. Theory of mind has to do with when you're trying to think about what another person is thinking. Okay? So individuals with autism have trouble in part with theory of mind types of tasks in that social cognition. If you're given morality judgment tasks, so you have to basically decide between the lesser of two evils. There's just no good solution that you just choose the lesser of two evils, like are 5 people going to die or is 1 person going to die types of scenarios. Those types of judgments also engage the medial prefrontal cortex. If you're thinking about the traits of other people, then we see activation here in the same spot as this more memory-evoking music, and also self-referential judgments, as I was saying earlier, engage the medial prefrontal cortex. So this kind of then ties in nicely, I think, with what I was telling about nostalgia earlier, and how that mediates this sense of social connectedness. Okay, fits very nicely with the whole story here. Okay, so, and then finally, a variety of emotion tasks also engages the medial prefrontal cortex. In a separate analysis, meta-analysis of emotion studies that try to sort of parse apart distinct sub-circuits in the brain that support emotional processing. One of those clusters is also this medial prefrontal cortex cluster, which, if we look in this complicated network diagram, actually serves as the intersection between a variety of these networks. This is kind of a complicated picture, but the main message here again is the medial prefrontal cortex is important for emotion. Okay, so that's pretty reasonable evidence that the medial prefrontal cortex is reasonably involved. But what I would like to do is to try to show even a tighter link. And the reason is that the model I was showing you, just music is playing, it's not playing, it's more memory-evoking or it's less memory-evoking, that's a fairly coarse model. Okay, we all know music is this rich phenomenon that unfolds in time, and you can listen to music and it kind of takes you on a journey. Okay, maybe it's taking you on this mental movie of the memory you're experiencing. But perhaps if you're not experiencing any particular memories, it's still sort of providing music for your ongoing thought processes, right? So it's a very dynamic stimulus that's engaging this very dynamic process in our minds. And I'd like to understand how those two things are coupled a little bit better. And so the goal here is to identify brain regions that follow movements of pieces of music as they move around in tonal space, which I'll explain here in a moment, and presumably support the person's experiences with the music. So you can think of this as music as being the soundtrack for this mental movie that's playing in your head, and the goal is to take a model of the structure of that soundtrack, okay, and use that kind of as a fingerprint to identify what's happening in the brain as one's having these memories, thoughts, mental images, and emotions. Okay, so here's your crash course for music theory, okay, for the evening. So most of the music that we hear is Western tonal music, and it relies on this concept of keys. So we talk about G major or B minor or F sharp major. And what keys are is they're just collections of pitches, collections of notes, or the technical term is pitch classes. And what pitch classes are is if you take this piano keyboard here and you just look at one octave, so an octave is a doubling in frequency, and then everything just repeats. Okay, so within that octave, it's divided into 12 equal steps on a logarithmic frequency scale. Okay, 12, so there are 12 pitch classes. 7 of those 12 belong to a particular key. So shown here with the green dots are those notes that belong to the key of G major. Okay, what we can now do is we can project the notes that belong to the key of D major, and we can see that except for this one right here, they're all the same. Okay, which means that G major and D major are very closely related to each other in a musical sense. Okay, we can contrast this with the key of F sharp major, shown here with the yellow dots, and you can see there's very little overlap between F sharp major and G major. So these are really distant from one another in a musical sense. What this means, so the way this is captured in music theory is with this thing called the circle of fifths, which arranges the various keys, major keys shown in red, minor keys shown in magenta here. It arranges them in terms of their musical proximity. So I just showed you G major and D major are close to one another. G major and F sharp major are far apart from one another. And what this means is for a composer, it's really easy to begin a piece in G major and go to D major, go to C major, and then come back to G major again. Okay, it's more of a challenge to go all the way over to F sharp major and then come back and still have it sound reasonably smooth. Okay, and, well, what does it mean to sound reasonably smooth? So let me give you an example. I'm going to play a sequence of chords that begins and ends in B major. And if you were in a psychology experiment, your task would be to say, how well does that final event fit with the preceding context? Okay? On a 7-point scale. 7 being really good, fits really well, and 1 being doesn't fit at all well. Okay, so here we go. Fits pretty well, right? It's just nice ending, everything, right? So now I'm going to play the exact same initial sequence of chords, but now the last chord is going to be the most stable, most representative chord of C major. Okay? How well does this fit? Not very well, right? Right, so if I had you sit in the lab for a couple of hours and I played this game with all these various combinations and all these various musical distances, I could collect all of those subjective ratings. Okay? And what those subjective ratings are they're a measure of psychological distance. Right? In that last example, we just traveled, it's like we were in California and then next thing we knew, we were over in New York. Right? Just all of a sudden, right? It just jerks you over there. It's not a very pleasant feeling. It's a great distance that you just traveled, right? So we just traveled that distance, that musical distance in our minds. And so we can collect all these musical distances, and then in the same way that you would take, say, a mileage chart for all the various cities in the U.S., so Los Angeles to San Francisco, Los Angeles to Seattle, Seattle to Chicago, and so on. You get your mileage chart. Well, you look at that mileage chart, and you can't really easily figure out, well, how are all the cities located on a map, right? You don't really get a very good sense of it. But what you can do is you can use this mathematical technique called multidimensional scaling, which asks, how can I take all those distances between all those cities, and how can I now arrange all those cities in order to preserve the distances? And if you do that and you plot it out, voila, you have your cities in the right place, on the map of the U.S. So we can do exactly the same thing with these subjective distances for music. and ask how do we have to arrange these keys relative to one another to preserve all these subjective distances. And that yields a map that looks like this. So we have the major keys here, C, G, D, just like on the circle of fifths, right? And the minor keys in between. And if you'll notice, the top edge and the bottom edge, the left edge and the right edge are the same. So what that means is that this really has the geometry of a torus, of a donut, right? And so this is the geometry of Western tonal music, of key structure in Western tonal music. And what's cool about it is that it's a construct that simultaneously captures music theory, cognitive psychology, and it turns out is also a parsimonious organization of pitch statistics of Western tonal music. Okay, so probably most of you perceive that last chord in that last example as being kind of out of place, right? And even if you don't have musical training, you're likely to perceive it that way. And why is that? You're not a musician. How do you know about this stuff, right? Well, it turns out that our brains, as we walk around the world, from the time we're born, we're basically trying to figure out the world. And what we do is we identify all the regularities in the world. Because if we can figure out the regularities in the world, it means our brains can then predict what's likely to happen. Okay? And we do that with music too. And so basically we internalize the statistical distributions of all the notes that occur. And so we hear a lot of the note C and a lot of the note G in this particular piece of music. Oh, that means we must be in C major. And our brains just automatically do that and enable those percepts that you just experienced. Okay? Well, practically what this means, though, is you can take a piece of music now, and based on the notes that are present in the melodies and in the harmonies, okay, they're going to generate a sense of, well, what key are we in? And as that changes through time, that's going to create a pattern of movement on the torus through time, which then is going to serve as a signature for that piece of music. So let's just illustrate this here. So what I've done is laid out the torus flat again, and the different letters indicate the different key regions. And what we do is we take the audio signal, we put it through a model of how the sound gets transduced into a neural signal in the ear. From that we extract what pitches are prevalent within about a 4 to 6 second sliding window. And based on those estimates of how many pitches occurred how many times, we then can assign these red colors, which indicate what tonal region are we in this moment of time in the music. So let me illustrate this.
Coisa mais linda, mais cheia de graça, ela na menina que vem, que passa, num doce balanço, caminho do mar. Moça do corpo dourado do sol de Ipanema, o seu balançado é mais que um poema, é a coisa mais linda que eu já vi passar. Porque estou tão sozinho. Porque tudo é tão triste. A beleza que existe, a beleza que não é só minha, que também passa sozinha. Se ela soubesse que quando ela passa, o mundo sorrindo se enche de graça e fica mais lindo por causa do amor.
Yes, it goes on. Usually I give this talk during the day, and I suggest, wouldn't it be nice to have a glass of wine and watch this animation? In our case, we can have more glasses of wine and watch more animations. Anyway, so you get a sense now of music moving in tonal space. And so what we can do is we can take each frame of that movie and we can use a set of 35 variables to describe each frame. I won't get into the technical details until later if you're interested. But I will just show you the model again, the statistical model that captures that. So let's just look at this bottom row of bars. So this patterned bar right here on the left, again, represents one of these 30-second excerpts of music. And there are 35 of these variables that now model that pattern of movement. And the main thing to appreciate here is that all these bars have different patterns, right? So they have different signatures of how music is moving in the major and minor keys. And so we can set up our model to ask, well, how well are the memory-evoking songs explaining now fluctuations in brain activity that are following this movement pattern, and how well do non-memory evoking songs couple with the brain activity. And I'll just show you the summary slide across individuals here. Again, slices running from left to right, and these colored regions indicate sort of the proportion of subjects at any given small little voxel, small little brain chunk that were exhibiting significant tonality tracking activity. And we can see, okay, again, it's a whole bunch of different brain areas. And this gets back to the slide that I was saying suggests that we have these strong experiences with music. It should really recruit multiple parts of the brain. And indeed, what we see here is this tonality tracking within the auditory cortex, so for the basic hearing. We see engagement of the so-called premotor areas, so part of the action system. We see engagement of the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, which is important for structural integration processes, so helping sort of maintain a coherent flow from one chunk of information to the next, both in language and in music. A little more dorsally in the lateral prefrontal cortex, we see engagement of this area that's been shown to be important for stringing together chunks of memories. So putting chunks of memories into the appropriate order. And so I think what's happening here is you have that mental movie associated with the memory playing in your mind. You're having to kind of string it together into that coherent movie, and this part of the brain may be supporting that process. We see activation of the visual cortices, presumably reflecting sort of the visual imagery aspect of that mental movie. And then, of course, the strongest area that we saw previously that increases in activation overall with more memory-evoking music is shown here also to now follow the structural details of that music. Now, what we can do is we can take that model and we can compare the activity explained by the memory-evoking music, tonality tracking regressors, and for those that don't evoke memories, and just express how well they modeled the activity within a particular brain area using this color scale here. So if it's red, it means it's biased towards following the structure of the memory-evoking music. If it's green, then it follows the structure equally well for both. Then we can just highlight some of these areas. So the auditory areas are fairly, do it reasonably well for both. But if we look now here at the medial prefrontal cortex, we can see that tonality following activity is strongly biased toward the music that's also memory evoking. Okay, so that's been a lot to digest. So I'm going to summarize. Actually, you're probably all hungry. You haven't had dinner yet. So, all right, a couple of slides of summary here. So I started out just by summarizing some of the recent literature that suggests that nostalgia is an emotion that increases a sense of meaning in life and optimism, which I think is a real powerful thing to realize. So existential threats, loneliness, and boredom cause us to become more nostalgic, and music is an excellent vehicle for providing the memories that support sort of that nostalgic reverie that can counteract these negative emotions. Listening to memory-evoking music engages many parts of the brain, but very strongly engages those parts of the brain that are responsible for helping maintain a sense of self, social representations, and emotions. And then I was just at a conference last week at Johns Hopkins called Music, Mind, and Meaning. So this was a summary slide I created for that talk, but I think it's really important here too. So when thinking about music and meaning, so there's a tendency for people usually to think or ask, is some particular music always going to elicit a particular emotion? Is it always going to have the same meaning for everybody who listens to it? And I personally think the answer is no. I just disconnected something, but I think we're still good.
Just your power to your laptop's not going to be on.
Oh, that's 5 seconds and we're done. So when thinking about music and meaning, I suggest it's important to recognize that the individual is not simply a recipient or perceiver of some music that of some meaning that might be intrinsic to the music, but rather music conveys meaning only insofar as it engages mental mechanisms or sets of brain areas beyond those necessary for basic auditory perception. Does it make you reminisce? Does it make you want to move, get up and dance? Things like that. And then finally, the modeling, time-varying structural properties of music allows us to identify brain areas that couple to that structure and presumably support the dynamic and meaningful experiences that we have with the music. Finally, I'd just like to acknowledge a couple of the people, Fred Barrett, a grad student in the lab now at Hopkins, who did all the nostalgia work, and then a longtime member of the lab, Stefan Tomic, and a number of undergrads and folks at our Imaging Research Center, and this was partially supported by a Templeton Advanced Research Program grant from the Meta-Nexus Institute and the Templeton Foundation. And thank you all very much for coming and for your attention.